Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The boarding gate. The airport was alive with its usual symphony, intercom announcements echoing through the vast halls, the hum of suitcase wheels on polished floors, and snippets of hurried conversations blending with the occasional laughter of children. Among this bustling sea of movement was Margaret Delaney, a 73-year-old woman whose every step seemed to defy the rush around her. Unlike the hurried passengers darting between gates, Margaret moved with a deliberate calm. Her heels tapped against the tile floor, each step purposeful, her head held high. She was dressed in an elegant navy blue suit, tailored perfectly to her form, with a pearl brooch glinting under the terminal's fluorescent lights. A simple leather handbag hung from her arm, and in her hand was a boarding pass that told a story of perseverance and triumph. For Margaret, this ticket was not just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of decades of resilience, of nights spent working tirelessly and days when she had to prove, time and again, that her place in the world was not given but earned. As she approached the boarding gate, a young man with slicked back hair and a nervous energy stood behind the counter. His name tag read Derek White. Margaret noticed the way his fingers tapped lightly on the desk, betraying a slight impatience. She slid her boarding pass toward him with a polite smile, saying nothing. Derek picked up the ticket, barely glancing at Margaret as he scanned it. His eyes flickered to the words "First Class" printed in bold letters, and for the first time, he looked up at her. Margaret caught the briefest hesitation in his expression, the way his brows furrowed slightly before he masked it with professional indifference. "This is for first class, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped and formal, as if he needed to clarify something obvious. Margaret raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Yes, I am aware," she replied, her voice steady, carrying the weight of someone who had weathered far greater storms than this moment. Derek's eyes scanned the boarding pass again, turning it over unnecessarily. He appeared to be searching for some evidence of a mistake, something to explain what he clearly saw as an anomaly. "I think there's been a mix-up," he said finally, his tone slower now, laced with a polite condescension. "First class is reserved for priority passengers. You'll need to wait for general boarding." The hum of the terminal seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, as if the world had leaned in to listen. Margaret tightened her grip on her bag, but her face remained composed. She had been here before, in moments like this. Not in airports, but in stores, offices, and countless other spaces where she was made to feel like she didn't belong. "Mr. White," Margaret began, her voice still soft but firm, "I assure you, this ticket was not purchased by accident." Derek's eyes darted to the growing line of passengers behind her. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of unseen eyes. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, ma'am. I can't hold up the boarding process." Margaret stood her ground, her gaze steady. "Step aside for what?" she asked, her tone calm but piercing. Derek hesitated again, and this time, the silence stretched between them. The tension was palpable. Margaret could feel the subtle shift around her, the way other passengers leaned in slightly, their curiosity mingling with discomfort. She could have stepped aside. She could have avoided the stares, the whispers, the quiet judgment. But Margaret Delaney was not the kind of woman who stepped aside anymore. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Derek shifted uncomfortably. "No problem, ma'am. I just need to confirm." "Confirm what?" Margaret interrupted, her voice now carrying an edge that demanded attention. Derek blinked, his composure faltering. He glanced down at the ticket again, as if seeing it for the first time. The flush of embarrassment crept up his neck as he realized his mistake. "Enjoy your flight," he said finally, sliding the boarding pass back to her. Margaret took the ticket, her hand steady, her gaze unwavering. She turned and walked toward the gate, her heels clicking against the floor with quiet authority. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, the whispers following her like shadows. Some passengers averted their gaze, embarrassed by what they had witnessed. Others watched her with a newfound respect, admiring the way she had held her ground without raising her voice. As Margaret settled into her seat in first class, she smoothed the wrinkles from her coat and unfolded a newspaper with deliberate care. She had no intention of letting anyone forget that she belonged. Behind her, Derek White remained at the gate, his expression clouded with unease. What he didn't know, what no one in the cabin knew, was that this moment, this seemingly small act of doubt and dismissal, had set off a chain of events that would ripple far beyond the confines of this airplane. Margaret Delaney was not a woman to be underestimated. Turbulence in the air. Margaret Delaney sank into the wide leather seat of the first-class cabin, exhaling softly as the world outside the airplane began to fade into the abstract, a blur of bustling airport gates and the endless expanse of the runway. This seat, luxurious and spacious, was a testament to everything she had worked for, but as she settled in, she could feel the familiar weight of being observed. The glances were subtle, but unmistakable. Eyes flickered toward her, assessing, questioning, calculating. Margaret had been here before, countless times, in countless rooms, and she knew this dance well. The cabin was filling now. A well-dressed couple in their 40s settled into the seats in the row ahead, exchanging quiet words as they removed their coats. Across the aisle, a younger man in a crisp business suit immediately retrieved a laptop from his bag, the screen illuminating his face as he began typing furiously. The quiet murmurs of passengers mixed with the clinking of glasses as a flight attendant moved gracefully through the cabin, offering pre-flight beverages. Margaret declined the champagne with a polite shake of her head, opting instead to fold her coat neatly across her lap. She smoothed the wrinkles with steady hands, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Around her, the quiet hum of first-class life continued uninterrupted. But Margaret was keenly aware of the undercurrent, a tension that had nothing to do with turbulence. As the engines roared to life and the plane taxied down the runway, Margaret felt the familiar press of the seat against her back, the subtle shift as the wheels left the ground. She turned her gaze to the window, watching as the airport shrank below her, the tiny figures of people hurrying about their lives disappearing into the distance. It was then that she noticed her, the flight attendant. Lauren Pierce, her name tag read. Lauren was young, mid-30s at most, with a carefully polished appearance that spoke of someone who took pride in her work. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her smile was practiced, almost mechanical, as she moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency. Lauren's warmth, however, seemed to flow selectively. Margaret noticed the way she leaned slightly toward the couple ahead, her tone light and friendly as she asked if they were comfortable. She lingered longer at the row across the aisle, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper as she shared a brief laugh with the businessman. But when she reached Margaret's row, her smile seemed to falter, replaced by a politeness that felt brittle, perfunctory. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Lauren asked, her voice neutral, her eyes barely meeting Margaret's. "Water will be fine," Margaret replied, her tone equally neutral, but there was a weight beneath her words, a quiet assertion of presence. Lauren poured the water with practiced ease, setting the glass on Margaret's tray table without a word. She moved on quickly, her attention shifting to the next row, as if Margaret were little more than a brief pause in her routine. Margaret sipped her water slowly, letting the cool liquid calm the simmer beneath her skin. She had long since learned to navigate moments like this, to carry the weight of these small, silent dismissals without letting them crush her. But as she watched Lauren laugh softly at a passenger's joke 2 rows ahead, Margaret couldn't help but feel the familiar ache of invisibility. The turbulence came without warning, a sharp jolt that sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Margaret gripped the armrests instinctively, though her face remained calm. Around her, passengers clutched at their seats, their conversations momentarily silenced. Lauren moved quickly, her practiced smile returning as she reassured passengers, checking seat belts and offering calming words. But Margaret noticed something. Lauren's steps faltered as she approached her row. Her gaze flickered toward Margaret briefly before shifting away, her hands busy with a blanket she draped over the lap of the woman across the aisle. Lauren moved on without a word, her footsteps soft but deliberate. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but Margaret felt it, the absence of acknowledgement, the quiet dismissal. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last, but something about this moment lingered. Perhaps it was the way Lauren had smiled so easily at the other passengers, the warmth in her voice that seemed to evaporate when she reached Margaret's row. Or perhaps it was the way the man across the aisle glanced at Margaret, his eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and discomfort before he returned to his book. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of her handbag. Inside was a journal, a place where she often captured moments like this, the small but significant instances that shaped her understanding of the world. She thought about reaching for it, about putting pen to paper to process the quiet storm building within her, but she decided against it. Not yet. As the turbulence subsided and the plane leveled out, the cabin returned to its usual rhythm. Passengers resumed their conversations, the clinking of glasses punctuating the soft hum of the engines. Lauren reappeared, her tray balanced expertly as she moved through the aisles. "Would you care for anything else?" she asked the couple ahead, her smile bright and genuine. Margaret watched as Lauren poured another glass of wine, her laughter ringing softly as she responded to a joke the man made. She moved to the next row, her warmth unwavering as she tended to the passengers there. But when she reached Margaret's row, the warmth vanished. Lauren's gaze barely brushed Margaret before she moved on, her footsteps quick and efficient. Margaret exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the armrest. She felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, the familiar ache of being seen but not acknowledged, of existing in a space where her presence was a quiet disruption. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, glancing at Margaret briefly before leaning toward her. His voice was low, hesitant. "They didn't offer you anything?" he asked. Margaret turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "No," she replied simply. The man hesitated, his brow furrowing. "That's unusual," he said, his voice trailing off. Margaret smiled faintly, tilting her head slightly. "Not as unusual as you might think," she said. The man straightened in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Margaret turned her gaze back to the window, watching as the clouds stretched endlessly in every direction. She had long since learned to weather storms like this, to let the weight of moments like these settle around her without letting them define her. But as she sat there, the faint tremor of turbulence still echoing in her chest, Margaret felt something shift. It was subtle, like the first crack in a sheet of ice, barely noticeable, but impossible to ignore. The storm, Margaret realized, wasn't in the air. It was here, in the cabin, in the spaces between people. And Margaret Delaney was not the kind of woman to let a storm pass unnoticed. The quiet resistance. The hours of a flight are measured differently, by the hum of engines, the clink of glasses, and the soft shuffle of attendants through narrow aisles. For Margaret Delaney, time felt like an old adversary, testing her patience as she remained seated in first class, quiet but unyielding. She knew her presence carried weight, though not the kind that could be measured in pounds or kilograms. It was a weight forged by years of perseverance, of standing firm when the world around her sought to diminish her. Lauren Pierce, the flight attendant, passed by her row again, her movements precise, her smile unwavering, except when it came to Margaret. Lauren's warmth flowed freely to others, wrapping them in comfort, yet Margaret remained an exception. Margaret had observed this phenomenon for decades, the invisible barriers people built to separate us from them, but this time, something about the dynamic gnawed at her in a way it hadn't in years. Lauren's actions weren't overt, they were subtle, like a whisper in a crowded room. She skipped Margaret's row when offering extra blankets, refills, or casual conversation. The absence of hostility didn't make the exclusion any less palpable. Margaret could feel it in the way Lauren's gaze slid past her, in the slight hesitation in her step as she moved down the aisle. Margaret turned her attention to the journal nestled in her handbag, the worn leather cover cool under her fingertips. She opened it, revealing pages filled with decades of reflections, sketches, and fragments of poetry. This was her sanctuary, a place where she could pour the weight of her experiences into words. But as she began to write, her pen poised above the page, she paused. Not yet, she thought. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition to the cruising phase of the flight. Outside the window, the sky was a canvas of soft blues and whites, clouds stretching endlessly in every direction. Margaret took a slow breath, grounding herself in the stillness. A soft voice broke her reverie. "Excuse me, ma'am," said the man across the aisle. His voice was tentative, almost apologetic. Margaret looked up, her calm gaze meeting his. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate. He hesitated before speaking again. "I couldn't help but notice, they haven't really been attentive," he said, gesturing subtly toward the flight attendants. Margaret's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "You're observant," she replied, her voice steady. The man leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just think it's odd. You're sitting in first class, and they barely acknowledged you." Margaret tilted her head, studying him. She could sense his discomfort, the way he struggled to articulate what he was witnessing without stepping into uncomfortable territory. "It's not as unusual as you might think," she said simply. The man straightened, clearly unsure of how to respond. Margaret offered him a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no further explanation. She appreciated his attempt to understand, even if he couldn't fully grasp the nuances of what she experienced. The quiet settled again, but Margaret felt the weight of the man's lingering gaze. He wasn't the first to notice the disparity, and he wouldn't be the last. These moments, these subtle imbalances, were often invisible to those who weren't subjected to them, but once noticed, they became impossible to ignore. Lauren reappeared, her tray balanced expertly as she moved through the aisle. She stopped at the couple seated ahead of Margaret, her voice light and cheerful as she refilled their glasses. Margaret watched her carefully, noting the ease with which Lauren interacted with them, the way her smile reached her eyes. As Lauren moved toward Margaret's row, her demeanor shifted. Her smile faded into a polite but distant expression, and her movements lost their warmth. "Anything else for you, ma'am?" she asked, her tone clipped. Margaret looked up, meeting Lauren's gaze with calm resolve. "No, thank you," she said, her voice steady but pointed. Lauren nodded curtly and moved on, her footsteps quick as if eager to escape the interaction. Margaret watched her retreat, feeling the familiar ache of invisibility settle in her chest. But this time, Margaret decided she would not let it pass unchallenged. She closed her journal, placing it carefully back into her handbag, and leaned slightly into the aisle. "Miss Pierce," she called, her voice carrying just enough weight to command attention. Lauren paused, turning back toward Margaret with a carefully neutral expression. "Yes, ma'am?" Margaret gestured to the glass of water on her tray table, the condensation pooling around its base. "I noticed you've been quite attentive to the other passengers," she began, her tone polite but firm. "But it seems you've overlooked my row more than once. Is there a reason for that?" The question hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Lauren's composure faltered, her cheeks flushing faintly as she glanced around the cabin. I apologize if I gave that impression," she stammered. "That wasn't my intention." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her gaze unyielding. "Intent and impact are often two very different things, Miss Pierce," she said. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, her hands tightening around the tray she held. "Of course, ma'am. I'll make sure to be more attentive," she said quickly, before turning and retreating toward the galley. The exchange was brief, but its impact rippled through the cabin. Margaret could feel the shift in the air, the way passengers around her began to reevaluate their own assumptions and biases. She knew that moments like this, though small, carried the potential to create cracks in the larger structure of prejudice and exclusion. As the flight continued, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. She had not raised her voice, nor had she demanded more than what was fair, yet she had made her presence known in a way that could not be ignored. It was a quiet resistance, one that required no fanfare, but left an indelible mark. Margaret leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly as the soft hum of the engines lulled her into a state of calm. She was no stranger to storms, but she had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful acts of defiance were the quietest. A legacy of resilience. The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, but for Margaret Delaney, it was the weight of the past that seemed to resonate more loudly than the sound of flight. The confrontation with Lauren Pierce, while brief, had stirred something deep within her, a reminder of the battles she had fought in a world that too often saw her as less than, as invisible. It wasn't just about the seat in first class, the subtle glances, or even the flight attendant's selective warmth. It was about the countless moments, stretched over decades, where she had been quietly reminded of her place. Margaret opened her eyes and looked around the cabin. The man across the aisle avoided her gaze, clearly unsure of how to process what he had witnessed. The couple in the row ahead shifted in their seats, their voices quieter now, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps discomfort. And Lauren Pierce, the flight attendant, moved through the aisles with a newfound stiffness, her earlier ease replaced by something more guarded. Margaret had seen this before. It wasn't anger or defiance that followed moments like these. It was discomfort, the kind that came when people were forced to confront the invisible structures they had unconsciously upheld. She didn't blame them, not entirely. Change was uncomfortable, and Margaret had long since learned to wield that discomfort as a tool. As the plane glided steadily above the clouds, Margaret reached into her handbag and retrieved her journal. She opened it to a blank page, the lined paper waiting patiently for her thoughts. Her pen hovered for a moment before she began to write. It's not the storm that shakes you, but the silence that follows. Today, I felt it again, that familiar pause, that hesitation, that quiet dismissal. It's a small thing, a fleeting moment, but its weight is immense. It's in the way they glance at you without really seeing you. It's in the spaces between their words, the hesitations that linger like unspoken truths. And yet, I remain. I sit here, in this seat I earned, and I refuse to let them diminish me. Her pen stilled as she considered the words. Writing had always been her refuge, a way to process the complexities of a world that often felt too heavy. But today, her thoughts felt different. They were sharper, more determined. Margaret's mind wandered back to the early days of her career. She had been one of the first Black women to break into a predominantly white industry, a feat that had come with its own set of challenges. She remembered the boardrooms where her ideas were dismissed until a white colleague repeated them. She remembered the networking events where she was mistaken for the help. She remembered the silent but unmistakable pressure to prove, again and again, that she deserved to be there. One particular memory surfaced, a day in 1973 when she had been passed over for a promotion despite being the most qualified candidate. She had confronted her boss, a man who had looked at her with a mix of pity and condescension. "You're doing great work, Margaret," he had said. "But you have to understand, people aren't ready for someone like you in that position." That moment had been a turning point. Margaret had walked out of that office, not defeated, but determined. She had poured herself into her work, earning respect, not through compliance, but through sheer excellence. And when she eventually left that company to start her own, she had done so with the knowledge that she was building something that no one could take from her. Margaret closed her journal and placed it back in her bag. The turbulence in her heart had settled, replaced by a calm resolve. She turned her attention to the window, watching as the clouds shifted below the plane, their shapes ever-changing but constant in their beauty. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent. The flight was nearing its end, but Margaret felt that her journey, in many ways, was just beginning. She glanced at Lauren Pierce, who was now seated at the front of the cabin, her posture rigid as she prepared for landing. Margaret wondered if the young woman had taken the moment to reflect, to question the quiet biases that had guided her actions. As the plane descended through layers of clouds, the city below came into view, a sprawling tapestry of lights and motion. Margaret's thoughts turned to the future. She had spent her life navigating spaces that were not designed for her, but she had never stopped pushing forward. And now, at 73, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, and the plane began its slow taxi to the gate. Passengers stirred in their seats, retrieving bags from overhead compartments and exchanging polite goodbyes. Margaret remained seated, letting the rush pass her by. When the cabin door opened, Lauren Pierce returned to Margaret's row, her expression hesitant but composed. "Thank you for flying with us, ma'am," she said, her tone measured. Margaret met her gaze, her eyes steady but kind. "Thank you, Miss Pierce," she replied. "And remember, growth often begins where comfort ends." Lauren blinked, her expression softening slightly. She nodded, and for the first time, Margaret saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. As Margaret stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't naive, she knew the world wouldn't change overnight. But she also knew that change often started with the smallest of cracks, the tiniest shifts in perspective. Margaret Delaney walked through the terminal with the quiet confidence of a woman who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. She was a force, a legacy, and a reminder that even in the face of adversity, resilience could carve a path forward. The ripple effect. The terminal buzzed with the usual post-flight chaos, families reuniting, business travelers hurrying to their next connection, and the steady stream of announcements echoing overhead. Margaret Delaney moved through it all with her signature calm, her leather handbag resting against her side and her heels tapping softly on the polished floor. She had no immediate plans to rush to her destination. Margaret had learned long ago that the journey often held just as much meaning as the destination itself. As she walked toward the baggage claim, her thoughts drifted back to the events of the flight. The confrontation with Lauren Pierce, though brief, had left an imprint on the atmosphere. Margaret knew this because she had seen it happen before, how even the smallest challenges to the status quo could unsettle people, forcing them to re-examine their actions, their assumptions, and their place in the world. Her calm, steady demeanor wasn't a shield against discomfort but a tool she had honed over decades. Margaret had discovered early in life that change rarely came from shouting or demanding. It came from holding up a mirror, from allowing others to see their reflection in the moments where their humanity faltered. As Margaret reached the baggage claim area, she noticed a familiar face waiting off to the side. It was the man from across the aisle, the one who had hesitantly pointed out Lauren's lack of attention. He caught her eye and raised a hand in a small, hesitant wave. Margaret approached him, her steps deliberate but kind. "Good afternoon," she greeted him with a warm smile. He nodded, his expression a mix of curiosity and respect. "Good afternoon. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I couldn't stop thinking about what happened on the flight." Margaret tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. "I've traveled a lot," he said, his words careful, "but I don't think I've ever noticed something like that before. Or maybe I just wasn't paying attention." Margaret's smile deepened, and she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Awareness is the first step," she said. "It's easy to miss the things that don't directly affect us. The real work comes when we decide to do something about what we've noticed." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You handled it with such grace. I don't think I could have done the same." Margaret chuckled softly. "Grace comes with practice. And practice often comes from necessity. But thank you for noticing. That, in itself, is more than most are willing to do." The man seemed to weigh her words, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Well, if nothing else, it's made me think differently. I'll be more mindful in the future." Margaret patted his arm gently. "That's all I could hope for." As the carousel began to churn and the first bags appeared, Margaret excused herself with a polite nod. She retrieved her suitcase, its smooth leather edges scuffed from years of travel, and began making her way toward the exit. But before she could leave, she heard a voice calling her name. "Miss Delaney." She turned to see Lauren Pierce hurrying toward her, her blonde bun slightly looser than it had been earlier, as if she had been running her hands through her hair. Lauren's expression was a mixture of nervousness and determination, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Margaret paused, raising an eyebrow as Lauren approached. "Miss Pierce," she greeted her evenly. Lauren hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I wanted to apologize for how I acted on the flight. I wasn't fair to you, Anne. I think I've been unfair to a lot of people without even realizing it." Margaret studied her, her gaze calm but piercing. Awareness, she said softly, echoing her earlier conversation. It's where it begins. Lauren nodded quickly. I've been thinking about it ever since you spoke to me. I've worked in this job for years, and I always thought I was treating everyone equally. But I wasn't. I see that now. Margaret's expression softened, and she placed a hand gently on Lauren's arm. It's never too late to start doing better, Miss Pierce. The important thing is what you do with what you've learned. Lauren's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she nodded again, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you. For calling me out. For giving me the chance to be better. Margaret smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Growth often begins where comfort ends, she said, repeating the words she had spoken earlier. It's up to you now to decide how far you're willing to grow. Lauren offered a small, grateful smile before stepping back, her posture less rigid than it had been on the plane. As Margaret watched her retreat, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She hadn't set out to change Lauren Pierce's perspective, but perhaps that was the beauty of moments like these. The ripples they created often reached farther than anyone could predict. Margaret continued toward the exit, the glass doors sliding open to reveal the bustling city outside. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint hum of car engines and the chatter of passers-by. She hailed a cab, her suitcase rolling smoothly behind her as she climbed into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the airport, Margaret gazed out the window, watching the city unfold before her. The skyscrapers, the crowded sidewalks, the endless stream of people, it all reminded her of the life she had built and the challenges she had overcome. She reached into her handbag and retrieved her journal, opening it to the page she had started earlier. Her pen moved swiftly across the paper, capturing the moment in words she knew she would revisit someday. Sometimes, change begins in the smallest of spaces, in a glance, a question, a moment of discomfort. Today, I saw the ripple begin. It's not about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It's about planting seeds in the cracks of the walls that divide us and watching as they grow, slowly but surely, into something stronger than the walls themselves. Margaret closed the journal and leaned back in her seat, a contented smile playing on her lips. She didn't know where the ripples of today's flight would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: her story, her presence, and her quiet resistance would continue to create waves long after she was gone. And that, she thought, was more than enough. The power of a single voice. The cab pulled away from the airport, weaving through the busy streets of the city. Margaret Delaney sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the world outside the window. The city had always been a place of energy, movement, and change, qualities Margaret had mirrored in her own life. But as the cab rolled on, her thoughts drifted to the events of the day. She hadn't expected the flight to be anything more than a journey from one place to another, but life, she had learned, had a way of making the ordinary extraordinary. Her destination was a small, boutique hotel in the heart of the city, a place she had chosen for its charm and intimacy. Margaret preferred spaces where she could blend into the rhythm of life, observing and reflecting without the distractions of grandeur. As the cab came to a stop, she stepped out, her suitcase rolling behind her, and made her way into the lobby. The hotel was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and a faint scent of fresh flowers. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted Margaret warmly. "Good evening, Ms. Delaney. Welcome to the Willowhaven Hotel." Margaret returned the smile and handed over her identification. As the receptionist completed the check-in process, Margaret's thoughts remained on Lauren Pierce, the flight attendant who had approached her at the baggage claim. The young woman's apology had been sincere, and Margaret could sense that it marked the beginning of a transformation. But Margaret also knew that change wasn't easy. It required persistence, self-reflection, and, above all, courage. She thought back to her younger self, navigating a world that often felt unwelcoming. Margaret had never been one to raise her voice in anger, but she had learned the art of speaking with conviction. Her grandmother had taught her that strength didn't always need to be loud, it could be steady, quiet, and unyielding, like a river carving through stone. Once settled into her room, Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and opened her journal once more. The events of the day swirled in her mind, and she began to write. Change is a curious thing. It doesn't arrive in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet spaces between them. It's in the choice to pause before speaking, to listen instead of react, to question instead of assume. Today, I saw a glimmer of that change in someone else, and it reminded me of why I've spent my life pushing forward, even when the road seemed impossibly steep. Margaret paused, her pen hovering over the page. She thought of all the people who had quietly supported her throughout her journey, the teachers who had encouraged her curiosity, the friends who had stood by her side, and the mentors who had reminded her of her worth. She thought of her late husband, James, whose unwavering belief in her had been a source of strength during her most challenging moments. Her reflections were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. Margaret rarely used her mobile device, preferring the tactile nature of handwritten letters and in-person conversations, but tonight, the glowing screen held a message that caught her attention. Subject: Thank you. From Lauren Pierce. Dear Ms. Delaney, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to thank you again for speaking with me earlier today. Your words have stayed with me, and I've spent the evening reflecting on how I can do better, not just in my role as a flight attendant, but as a person. You were right when you said that growth begins where comfort ends. I realize now that I've been too comfortable in my assumptions, and it's time for me to challenge them. I've already started making a list of ways I can be more intentional in how I treat others, especially those who might feel unseen. Thank you for your kindness, your grace, and your example. I'll carry this lesson with me always. With gratitude, Lauren Pierce. Margaret smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and hope. She hadn't set out to change Lauren Pierce's perspective, but it was a reminder of the power of a single voice. Change didn't always require an audience or a stage. Sometimes, it began with one person, one conversation, one moment. The following morning, Margaret rose early, her body accustomed to the rhythm of decades spent waking before the sun. She dressed in her favorite navy blue suit, a symbol of her resilience, and headed out into the city. Today, she had a meeting with a group of young professionals who had invited her to speak about her life and the lessons she had learned along the way. The meeting was held in a modest community center, the walls adorned with photographs and artwork celebrating diversity and resilience. Margaret was greeted warmly by the organizer, a young woman named Amara, who introduced her to the attendees, a mix of bright-eyed graduates, mid-career professionals, and even a few retirees seeking inspiration. Margaret took her place at the front of the room, her hands resting lightly on the podium. She began her speech with a story, one from her early career, when she had been the only Black woman in a boardroom full of men who doubted her capabilities. She spoke of the challenges she had faced, the quiet resistance she had employed, and the moments of triumph that had made it all worthwhile. As she spoke, Margaret noticed the way the room leaned into her words. The young professionals scribbled notes furiously, their eyes wide with admiration. The older attendees nodded knowingly, their own experiences reflected in Margaret's stories. And Amara, the organizer, watched with a quiet intensity, her hands clasped tightly as if holding on to every word. Margaret concluded her speech with a simple yet powerful message: the world may not always make room for you, but that doesn't mean you don't belong. Carve your own space, and in doing so, you'll make room for others to follow. The room erupted into applause, but Margaret's focus remained on the faces before her, their expressions filled with determination, gratitude, and hope. She knew that her story was no longer just her own. It was part of a larger tapestry, woven with the threads of countless lives and experiences. As Margaret returned to her hotel that evening, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The events of the past 2 days had reminded her of the impact one person could have, not just in the lives of others, but in the quiet shift of the world's trajectory. Lauren Pierce's apology, the man on the plane who had noticed her treatment, and now the young professionals who had been inspired by her story, all of these moments were ripples in the vast ocean of change. Margaret opened her journal one last time before bed, her pen moving with a steady grace. The world may not always be kind, but it is always in motion. Each step we take, each word we speak, and each choice we make adds to that motion. Today, I was reminded of the power of small actions, of the way a single voice can echo far beyond its origin. And as I lay my head down tonight, I am grateful, not just for the journey I've traveled, but for the chance to guide others along their own. With that, Margaret closed her journal, turned off the bedside lamp, and drifted into a peaceful sleep. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she was ready to face it with the same quiet strength and unwavering resolve that had carried her this far.